Good day, dear students. So I'll be covering a few doubts in physiology which have been put up. So let's start with the first one. Now the first question is, arterial oxygen content is reduced in which of the following? The options being stagnant hypoxia, anemic hypoxia, histotoxic hypoxia, or the hypoxic or arterial hypoxia. So basically these options are the four types of hypoxia, and we have to answer that in which of these types of hypoxia would your oxygen content fall. So now we all know hypoxia is a condition wherein due to a plethora of reasons our tissues are failing to receive an adequate oxygen supply, and we all know that oxygen supply to the tissues is very vital. All the tissues have to be well perfused with oxygen rich blood, especially the most vital one being our brain. If our brain is cut off from oxygen for even beyond a certain amount of time, there will be cerebral hypoxia, and that could be life threatening. So when we talk about the types of hypoxia, the first one which has been mentioned here is the anemic hypoxia. Now anemia, we all know, is a condition wherein there is a reduction in the hemoglobin levels, and hemoglobin is very important for the adequate amount of oxygen carrying capacity. So the better the hemoglobin, the better is the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. So what happens in anemic hypoxia is that due to the reduction in the hemoglobin levels, due to a multiple number of reasons, like due to hemorrhage, due to vitamin deficiencies, you all know the causes of anemia. So due to that, the oxygen levels in the blood are normal, but due to reduction in hemoglobin, the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood reduces. So that is anemic hypoxia. The next one mentioned here is the ischemic or stagnant hypoxia. Now here what happens is that due to some hypercoagulability or increased viscosity of blood, the blood flow is very sluggish. So even though the oxygen levels and the hemoglobin levels are normal, the blood flow is reduced, and due to that the tissues are not able to receive adequate circulation, and hence they receive less oxygen. So that is stagnant hypoxia. Now this could happen due to again any reason which would cause a sluggish blood flow could cause this kind of hypoxia. So any kind of hyperviscosity conditions or any kind of arterial or venous obstruction. Now the next one is the histotoxic hypoxia. This type of hypoxia occurs when there is some abnormality in the tissues which are receiving the blood. So the blood flow, the oxygen levels, everything is completely fine, but there's some abnormality in the tissues due to which they fail to receive the oxygen. So the oxygen is reaching there, but it cannot be utilized. The most common example is due to some narcotic overdoses or cyanide poisoning, in which there's some enzyme defects and the tissues are unable to utilize the oxygen well, and hence they get hypoxic. And the fourth and the most important one is the hypoxic or arterial hypoxia. Now what happens is that the oxygen content in the arteries, the arterial blood, it faces a shortage or scarcity of oxygen, and even though the hemoglobin level and everything is normal, the oxygen levels itself are low. Now this is mostly occurring due to any kind of lung diseases like asthma, pneumonia, due to high altitudes, deep sea divers, bronchospasm. So some kind of anesthetic agents which are inhaled, they can also cause this type of hypoxia. So now you can understand, with the help of this table, in this hypoxic hypoxia, this is the only type wherein the arterial oxygen content has actually come down, whereas everything else is normal. In the anemic hypoxia, the hemoglobin count has come down even though the oxygen content is normal. In stagnant hypoxia, both the values are normal, but the rate of blood flow has dropped. Whereas in histotoxic hypoxia, all the three factors, the oxygen content, hemoglobin and blood flow, is completely normal, but there's an abnormality in the tissues. So to answer your question here, there's only one type of hypoxia where your arterial oxygen content is reduced, and that is option D, or the hypoxic hypoxia. Now the next question is, minimum blood pressure is seen in. The options are aorta, arteries, capillaries and venules. Now our circulatory system mainly constitutes your arteries, veins and capillaries, and we all know that the pressure which is passed on by the blood flowing within the vessel onto the vessel walls is nothing but our blood pressure. Now the aorta is the largest blood vessel in the human body, so obviously it also has the maximum amount of blood pressure because it directly contains all the blood which is emptied from the left ventricle into it, and then it transmits this oxygenated blood to different parts of the body. So as it transmits this blood, it will divide into arteries, which will further divide into smaller vessels called arterioles. These arterioles will further divide into even smaller vessels called as capillaries, as you can see in this diagram. Here the exchange of the waste products and useful products occurs at the capillary level. Then the capillaries will further divide into venules and then finally into veins. Now, if you know, our arteries are much more thick walled and muscular as compared to our veins, which are not as thick. They are pretty much thin walled. Why is this the reason? This is because arteries have a much higher pressure blood flowing through it as compared to veins. So you can see here blood pressure is highest within the arteries like the aorta, and along with that, after that the next highest vessel would be the arteries. The blood pressure in veins is pretty low due to their structure and flow of the blood against gravity. So here the blood flow is much more sluggish and slow. This is the reason why when we have a bleed from the artery, the bleed is more of a fountain or a squirt of blood with very rapid bleeding, whereas in veins, if there's a cut or a tear in the vein, the bleeding is much more slow and easier to control. So here the minimum blood pressure will always be in the veins, and here the option would be option D, or the venules. Now the next question is, the most common type of calcium channels in skeletal muscles are. Now these calcium channels are of three types, the most important one being the type 1, which is the voltage gated calcium channels. Now these channels are present in various organs of our body, and they have selective permeability to the calcium ions. Now among these voltage gated channels we have 5 types: L, T, N, P and R. Most important ones being the L type as well as the T type calcium channels. Now when we talk about these calcium channels, this L basically stands for a long lasting type of channel, which is a high voltage activated channel, and these L type channels are present in the skeletal muscles and most of the cardiac cells as well, whereas the T type channels are the low voltage type channels which are present only in certain parts of the heart, namely the pacemaker and also in the neuron cells. So the skeletal muscles basically contain this high voltage activated or the L type calcium channel. So remember, L stands for long lasting. And one more important point here is these calcium channel blockers, which are drugs which are given for patients suffering from severe hypertension or arrhythmias, they are mainly designed in such a way that they block these L type calcium channels, because most of the cardiac cells contain these L type channels. So here, to answer your question, the calcium channels which are seen in skeletal muscles is the L type voltage gated calcium channels. Now the next question is the contribution of the operation of the sodium potassium electrogenic pump for development of net minus 90 MV on the resting membrane potential is. Now this question sounds a little confusing. Just take it bit by bit. First of all, what is this RMP? I'm sure you all are aware when you all have studied about local anesthesia. This resting membrane potential is usually a minus 70 MV. So what exactly does this mean? Now we all know that in general our membrane is more permeable to potassium and impermeable to sodium. In a resting state, the nerve membrane is not permeable to sodium, it is permeable to potassium. So what happens is that the sodium builds up outside, whereas the potassium is inside. But along with that, there are also some channels which are called as the potassium leak channels, and this allows some amount of potassium to also end up leaking outside. So what happens? There's more positive charge outside the membrane and less inside, and hence there's a minus 70 or a negative resting membrane potential. Now along with this RMP, there's also something called the sodium potassium pump. This pump basically pumps 3 sodiums outside and 2 potassium channels inside the cell. Now along with this resting membrane potential of -70, which I said is contributed by the impermeability of the nerve membrane, along with some leaking channels which will leak potassium outside the membrane. Along with that, this pump is also present, which will also by itself, as you can see, pump 3 sodium outside and 2 potassium inside. And since the number of ions it's pumping outside is more than the amount of ions it's getting inside, the net charge would obviously be negative. Since both of them are positive, but there's more positive outside and less positive inside, the net negativity, it will also add another 4 mV, -4 mV of negative potential. So here the question is, how much is contributed by this pump? This pump by itself also contributes another additional -4 millivolts of negativity to the resting membrane potential. There are a number of things which will contribute to this RMP. Here the question is about the NaK pump. So this pump, by pumping 3 Na outside and 2 K plus inside, it will contribute an additional -4 mV to the resting membrane potential. So this is exactly what I said. Now, along with that, due to all the other factors, what happens is that the net membrane potential ends up becoming -90. There are also a number of other factors which play and add their own negativity to it. But by this pump, it's a -4 millivolt negativity which is added to the RMP. Now, there was a doubt regarding the concept of blood grouping. It's a pretty straightforward thing, wherein they can ask you a case-based question and ask you to identify the blood group. So it's very easy to understand. So in case of this red blood cell, if the blood group is A, there will be an antigen which is A and the antibody B. In case of B, it's exactly vice versa, the antigen B with antibody A in the plasma. In group AB, both the antigens A and B will be present, but no antibodies in the plasma. Whereas in group O, or O blood group, there will be no antigens but both the antibodies in the plasma. So do not get confused. The name of the group directly correlates with which antigen is present. So if it's a group A, it will be having the A antigen and the opposite antibody, and vice versa. And of course, if they've mentioned that there's a positive RH, then it will be, for example, if a question is asked if the patient has the antigen A and a positive RH group, then the group would be A positive. Now, another question was asked regarding the release of renin from the kidney. When is it released and what is the situation which would prompt the release of this hormone? Now, due to any reason, due to severe dehydration, if the patient is suffering from uncontrolled diarrhea or vomiting, there's a lot of water loss from the body, or a lot of loss in blood volume due to maybe an accident leading to severe blood loss. So due to any reasons, what could happen is that there will be a drop in the blood pressure as well as a drop in the fluid volume. So these are two stimulatory factors which will stimulate this release of renin from the kidney. The two most important factors are when there is loss of water, along with fluid loss, there will also be a loss of sodium or a drop in blood pressure. So due to any of these two factors, what happens is this renin gets released from the kidney and it will act, as you know, on the angiotensinogen from the liver, and it will form angiotensin 1. At that time, this angiotensin converting enzyme is released from the lungs, which will convert it into angiotensin 2. This angiotensin 2 has an effect on the blood vessels by causing narrowing or vasoconstriction. Along with that, the angiotensin 2 will act on our adrenals to release the aldosterone, as you can see here. This aldosterone will act on the kidneys, as we know, and it will cause reabsorption of sodium and water. So this is the renin-angiotensin system. The two most important stimulatory factors, like I said, would be a loss of sodium, loss of water, and drop in blood pressure. So Do not get confused in this. There was a confusion regarding the sodium. How does the sodium drop or raise affect the renin? Just remember that any loss of water and sodium, it will go hand in hand. So whenever there's a loss of sodium or loss of water along with a drop in the BP, this renin release will be increased. And if there is excessive amount of water or sodium in the body due to any reason, there's a lot of water retention or increased volume of fluid in the body, then this renin release will be decreased. Now the next question was concerning the adrenal hormones. What are the different hormones which are released by the adrenal gland? Now we all know this adrenal gland has located on top of the kidneys, like a cap over the kidneys. This gland has two parts: the outermost layer of the adrenal gland called the adrenal cortex, and the inner layer, which is the adrenal medulla. Now as you can see in this image, this adrenal cortex has three zones, in which each zone secretes its own hormone. So when we start with the outermost zone, as you can see here, the zona glomerulosa. This zona glomerulosa secretes secretes a hormone which is known as aldosterone, which is a mineralocorticoid. So you can see here the zona glomerulosa is going to secrete the mineralocorticoid aldosterone. The inner layer after that is the zona fasciculata. This zone will secrete corticosteroids like cortisol along with a small amount of androgens like testosterone. So that is the zona fasciculata, as you can see here. Coming to the next, or the inner zone, that is the zona reticularis. Now this zona reticularis will secrete a hormone known as the dehydroepiandrosterone or DHES. Okay, so this is the zona reticularis, and then we have the innermost or the adrenal medulla. This is mainly going to secrete our catecholamines, which is adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now there was a doubt regarding this dehydroepiandrosterone, which, like I said, is secreted by the zona reticularis. Now what exactly is this hormone? So basically it is also known as androstenolone. Okay, this hormone is secreted, like I said, by the zona reticularis, and the question which was asked was, is it secreted exclusively by the female gland or is it secreted by both male and the female adrenal gland? So this hormone is secreted by both the male and female adrenal gland. One important thing to remember is it is an endogenous steroid. So it is a steroid which is located or produced by the body itself, and one of the most abundant circulating steroids. All the other steroids have to be administered exogenously. This is the endogenous and most abundant endogenous steroid. Now what is the main role of this? As you know, it will produce these androgens like androstenolone is basically DHEA, which functions as a metabolic intermediate in the biosynthesis of androgen and estrogen. So in the process of synthesis of testosterone and estrogen and all these androgenic hormones in males and females, this DHEA is a very important metabolic intermediate. So while in the process of the production of these androgens, this DHEA is formed as an intermediate, and this DHEA will then activate and form the potent forms of estrogen as well as testosterone, and it will be responsible for all the different androgenic features which is seen in both males and females. So to answer your question, it's not only exclusively secreted by the female gland, it's very important for production of both the male and female sex hormones. So it will be produced by both the glands by the zona reticularis of the adrenal cortex.